A pocket knife wasn't going to cut it. Not for this trip, anyway. Somewhere on a broken-down road in Europe, a young engineer made a decision that would eventually change what's sitting in millions of pockets, glove boxes, and tool belts around the world. This is the story of Leatherman, and it's not really a rise and fall. It's a fight to survive its own success, more than once. In 1975, Tim Leatherman and his wife Chow were backpacking through Europe on almost no money. They bought a cheap, unreliable car because it was all they could afford, and it broke down constantly. Tim had a pocket knife with him, fine for slicing bread for dinner, useless for fixing an engine on the side of a road. What he actually needed was pliers, something that could grip and twist, not just cut. Nothing on the market combined the two. A knife was a knife. Pliers were pliers. Nobody had thought to merge them. That gap stuck with him long after the trip ended. He came home and started sketching, not trying to build an industry, just trying to solve his own problem so he'd never be stuck again with the wrong tool in his pocket. It took him 8 years to turn that sketch into something sellable. 8 years of prototypes that didn't quite work, pivot points that wore out, designs that looked clever on paper and fell apart in the hand. He pitched the idea to knife companies. They passed. He pitched it to tool companies. They passed too. Nobody believed a folding multi-tool with built-in pliers had a real market. In 1983, Tim partnered with his friend Steve Berliner. No factory, no major investors, no guarantee a single retailer would carry what they were building. What they had was a working prototype and 8 years of stubbornness. They founded the Leatherman Tool Group anyway, betting that somewhere out there, plenty of people had stood on the side of a road wishing they had something better than a pocket knife. By the end of their first full year, they'd sold almost 30,000 units. Tim later said he couldn't believe it. After nearly a decade of rejection, someone was finally saying yes, and then thousands more. That first tool, the PST, wasn't flashy. It had pliers, a knife blade, a few screwdrivers, and a design that held up under real use. In a market full of single-purpose gimmicks, something that simply worked stood out. The growth that followed wasn't explosive, it was steady and word of mouth. Electricians told other electricians, mechanics told other mechanics, soldiers carried them overseas and came home swearing by them. Leatherman built its reputation one satisfied customer at a time, all from a single factory floor in Portland, Oregon. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Through the 80s and 90s, plenty of American manufacturers were already shifting production overseas to cut costs. Leatherman didn't. Every stage stayed in Oregon, from stamping the steel to heat-treating it, grinding it, and assembling it by hand. In 1996, the company released the tool that would define it for the next 30 years, the Wave. It was the first Leatherman where you could access the blades without opening the main handles, which sounds small until you've actually used one in the field. That single design shift turned the Wave into the company's best-selling product almost overnight. It still holds that title today, decades later, through changing trends and changing competitors. The Wave tells you something about how this company thinks. It didn't chase whatever multi-tool fad was popular. It solved a real specific annoyance, made the tool faster to use, and let the product speak for itself. By the 2000s, Leatherman tools were sold in more than 70 countries. The company was producing thousands of tools a day, running through tons of American steel every year, more than 4 times the weight of the Statue of Liberty annually. Soldiers carried them into combat zones, and stories started circulating about a Leatherman in a pocket or vest, stopping a bullet that would have otherwise gone straight through. Whether every version of that story holds up under scrutiny or not, the reputation stuck. For a lot of people, this wasn't a gadget anymore. It was something they trusted enough to carry into situations where their lives were on the line. But here's where the story gets complicated, and where most brands in Leatherman's position start to crack. Success invites competition. Once Leatherman's original patent started expiring, that competition flooded in, and it came in cheap. Factories overseas, mostly across China, began producing multi-tools that looked almost identical to Leatherman's designs. Same basic layout, similar tool selection, similar silhouette. The price wasn't similar at all. You could find knockoffs selling for $15 or $20 sitting on the same shelf as a genuine Leatherman priced 5 to 10 times higher. To a casual shopper, that gap probably looked like pure markup. It wasn't. The steel wasn't the same. The heat treatment wasn't the same. The tolerances on the pivot points weren't the same. Cheaper tools loosened faster, dulled faster, and snapped under stress a genuine Leatherman would have shrugged off. But none of that mattered to someone who just wanted pliers in their glove box and never planned on stress testing them. If all a buyer saw was the price tag, the cheaper option won by default. This is the part of the story where a lot of tool brands don't survive. When your design becomes the blueprint for an entire category of cheaper alternatives, you either get priced out of your own market, or you have to keep convincing customers the original is worth paying for. Leatherman chose to fight on quality instead of price, the harder and slower path, but the only one that protects what the brand actually stands for. Around the same time, the company ran into a separate problem closer to home. California enforces a stricter standard than the federal government for what qualifies as made in USA. Leatherman, like other American manufacturers, got caught in that gap. It wasn't a scandal, it was a labeling adjustment. Tools sold into California started carrying language like made in USA with US and foreign components instead of a flat, unqualified claim. That sounds small. For a brand whose entire identity was built around American manufacturing, even a technical labeling change became a talking point for critics looking for a crack in the armor. Some longtime customers felt like the company they'd trusted for decades was quietly backing away from a promise they'd bought into. So now Leatherman was dealing with two pressures at once: cheap overseas competition eating into market share from below, and public scrutiny questioning its Made in America identity from the side. For a smaller, privately held company with no Wall Street safety net, either pressure alone could have started a real, lasting decline. This is usually where a company starts cutting corners to survive, moving some production overseas, quietly swapping in cheaper materials, chasing a trend for a quick sales bump. That pattern repeats across American manufacturing again and again. Leatherman didn't take that route. The factory stayed in Portland. The steel kept coming from American mills. Instead of competing on price, the company leaned harder into what a $15 knockoff could never replicate: consistency, durability, and a warranty that actually meant something. Every tool leaving that Oregon facility still gets inspected by hand. Workers open the handles, check the tension, and verify the assembly before a tool ever reaches a shelf. That process is slow and expensive. It's also why a genuine Leatherman bought 20 years ago can still be working fine today, while a cheap copy from last year is probably sitting broken in a drawer. That strategy worked, but it wasn't free. Margins got tighter. The company had to be deliberate about every dollar because it could no longer assume customers would pay a premium just for the name on the handle. And here's the twist nobody expected when the knockoffs first flooded the market. They didn't kill Leatherman, they reinforced its reputation. A lot of people bought the cheap version first, watched a hinge loosen or a blade chip, and then went out and bought the real thing anyway. The counterfeit wave became an unintentional advertisement for exactly why the original was worth the extra money. By the 2000s, the company was producing more than 15,000 tools a day, still in Portland, still running on American steel. The Wave was still the bestseller almost 2 decades after its release, outperforming newer models the company had introduced since. Leatherman had weathered the knockoff war and come out the other side with its manufacturing intact and its reputation, if anything, stronger than before. Then came the next test, and this one was quieter. Not a flood of competition, but a change at the top after more than a decade of stability. Ben Rivera had joined Leatherman in 1991 as an engineer, long before he ever ran the place. Over 34 years, he became one of the people most responsible for shaping its modern product lineup. He became president and CEO in 2013 and led the company for 13 years. In January of 2026, Rivera transitioned into a different role within the company, and Chris Hamper, who had served as Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer since 2012, stepped up as the new president and CEO. Leadership transitions are where a lot of legacy brands quietly start to drift. New priorities come in. Institutional knowledge walks out the door. But this wasn't framed as a crisis, and it didn't look like one from the outside either. It was succession handled the way it's supposed to happen. Someone who already understood the business inside out, stepping up after more than a decade of preparation, working alongside the person who'd shaped the modern company for over 30 years. So where does that leave the story? Leatherman never really fell, not the way a title like that might suggest. What it survived was something more specific, a flood of cheap competition that could have hollowed out its core market, a labeling controversy that could have cracked open its Made in USA identity, and a generational leadership transition that could have destabilized a company run the same way for over a decade. Any one of those pressures has ended other manufacturers outright. Leatherman absorbed all three and kept its factory running in the same city it started in more than 40 years ago. That's the real arc here, not a fall, but a series of moments where falling was genuinely on the table and the company kept choosing the harder, slower path instead. Stick to the steel, stick to Oregon, stick to inspecting every tool by hand, even when it would have been cheaper not to. Back where this story started, Tim Leatherman just wanted pliers that worked on the side of a broken-down road in Europe. 40 years later, the company built around that one frustration is still solving the same basic problem for soldiers, electricians, hikers, and anyone else who's ever needed a tool that simply refuses to quit. The cheap copies came and mostly went. The labeling fight came and went. The leadership changed hands for the first time in over a decade, calmly and on its own terms. And the Wave, the same tool that turned Leatherman into a household name back in 1996, is still sitting at the top of the sales chart today.